everyone, and happy Monday. So, Tara, the week leading up to the debate, some strange things started happening. And I'm on TikTok all the time, and I was seeing all of these conservative accounts speaking out because massive, big conservative accounts were getting banned left and right. Okay, so everyone on TikTok started talking about it, and they're like, what could this be? Is it that they're trying to silence conservative commentators before the debate, or is there something else going on? And I think it could be because the Supreme Court just made a decision to basically strip our First Amendment right to free speech when it comes to social media. So, what happened with all this, just to give some background, is conservative states, along with people who were censored and banned on social media during the COVID era, sued the federal government for influencing censorship policies of the social media companies. And the plaintiffs actually won that case. And there was an injunction that was placed on the Biden White House, including Press Secretary KJP, along with numerous government agencies that prohibited them from meeting with big tech companies. And I think we briefly covered this before when it had happened. Well, that case ended up getting appealed and it was sent to the Supreme Court, where the court just ruled 6-3 that the plaintiffs had no standing to sue the federal government. This shocked me, Tara, because I mean, after everything we learned from the Twitter files, along with Mark Zuckerberg admitting on the Joe Rogan podcast that the FBI influenced their policies, like, I cannot believe that the Supreme Court ruled that this was absolutely okay. And so Justice Barrett, who I'm very disappointed in, by the way, she spoke for the court saying, quote, to establish standing, the plaintiffs must demonstrate a substantial risk that in the near future they will suffer an injury that is traceable to a government defendant and redressable by the injunction they seek. Because no plaintiff has carried that burden, none has standing to seek a preliminary injunction, end quote. So now, like, is it any wonder that all of a sudden all these conservatives are being banned left and right? And it sounds like these social media companies can just decide whatever they want to be misinformation and now have the legal authority to censor American citizens, or at least that's what I'm reading here. And that would mean like our First Amendment right is just out the window on social media.
Yeah, but it's possible that this ruling may not be a slam dunk yet. So I'm going to play this clip from Real AF last week, and then we'll talk about why.
Yeah, so did the federal government.
Yeah. The FBI calls you and says, "Hey, can you censor these people?" What are you going to do?
Well, that's what Zuckerberg said when he was on Rogan.
Yep.
He said straight up, he's like, the FBI called us and told us to do this, and we had to do it. And dude, when you guys think about, free speech and the First Amendment in this country, and you say, okay, well, the government's not allowed to censor free speech. Well, that's what that is.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what they're saying, obviously the fear mongers and the conservative, media, which is really no better than the media on the left. They blow this up and act like, oh, well, these people are bought off. No, actually, they just weren't able to show what they were trying to show. And they're revamping the case right now to take it back. So, and you know how I know that? Because I fucking asked the guy that has the lawsuit. So I called him up myself. I said, hey, what's this mean? He said, nothing. He said, we got to go back and we got to do a better job of showing the proof of standing and damages. And we're going to win when we go back.
Yeah, because the proof is there.
No shit.
The proof is there. And so what I do like here, though, so conservative Justice Samuel Alito wrote a blistering dissenting opinion joined by fellow conservatives Clarence Thomas and also Neil Gorsuch, who leans libertarian. He said, quote, victims of the campaign perceived by the lower courts brought this action to ensure that the government did not continue to coerce social media platforms to suppress speech, Alito began. All these victims simply wanted to speak out on a question of the utmost public importance. Our country's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was and remains a matter of enormous medical, social, political, geopolitical, and economic importance. And our dedication to a free marketplace of ideas demands that dissenting views on such matters be allowed, he announced. I assume that a fair portion of what social media users had to say about COVID-19 and the pandemic was of little lasting value. Some was undoubtedly untrue or misleading, and some may have been downright dangerous, Alito noted. But we now know that valuable speech was also suppressed. This is what inevitably happens when entry to the marketplace of ideas is restricted. He concluded by saying, for months, high ranking government officials placed unrelenting pressure on Facebook to suppress Americans' free speech. Alito concluded, because the court unjustifiably refuses to address this serious threat to the First Amendment, I respectfully dissent. Yeah, so I mean, I hope I hope they do bring it back.
Well, I think that's a fair point.
Okay, so I guess we'll see if Andy's correct because this lawsuit was started by former Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt, who's a good friend of Andy's. He's been on the podcast several times. So I think if anyone would have insider info about what's going on, it's definitely him. So hopefully we'll see more on this case.
Well, that gives me hope. He needs to go talk to Matt Taibbi because he has all the documentation they could possibly need to win this case. And while that ruling feels like a blow, another ruling took place that will change everything and possibly be the start of breaking up the deep state for good and could actually play into the whole social media thing. So the court reversed what was known as the Chevron legal doctrine, which was put in place back in 1984. And it's been the basis for thousands of federal regulations by unelected officials of the alphabet agencies. So basically, what happened since 1984 is Congress will pass a law, but if there's any question on the interpretation of that law, like anything at all that's not clear, government agencies had full authority to interpret the law however they see fit without having to go through Congress or anything like that. So this meant that unelected government bureaucrats could go wild with no checks and balances. And they sure did. So this will end like all of that's been going on. It will rein in the government agencies because now if there's a question on a law, instead of government agencies being able to interpret it however they see fit, it's going to go to the courts to decide. So this is welcoming news to the right, and for a couple of reasons. So first, conservatives have always pushed for less federal regulation and control and more individual freedoms. So by limiting the regulatory power of these agencies, it rails in the control of the federal government. So that's a good thing, obviously. I don't understand why anyone is against that, but there's a lot of people on the left that are. But second, we have seen these agencies go rogue and, they're not paying attention to the law. And in recent years, with everything from the unprecedented attacks on the leading political candidate to people like Attorney General Merrick Garland not complying with congressional subpoenas and acting above the law, like they have just gone wild. And it's so in our face. I mean, how many episodes have we done about this? And so I was reading an article, an AP article, and they quoted Iowa Republican Chuck Grassley. And he said the ruling, quote, restores appropriate balance to the three branches of government. Congress will now be under extreme pressure to be more specific when writing legislation so that a bill's plain text can be clearly interpreted by the courts and federal agencies when legislation becomes law, end quote. Now, I think this is a good point, right? So if they have to be really specific, they're not going to be able to pass these 1,000-page bills with like no notice whatsoever. So that could help with that as well. But I want to bring up the left's view of this. So that same AP article quoted New York Rep. Gerald Nadler, fucking hate that guy, the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee. So he said the decision, quote, comes at the expense of everyday Americans who depend on federal agencies to look out for their health and safety, not the bottom lines of giant corporations, end quote. Tara, wasn't it Reagan that said the worst words you can hear is we are from the government and we're here to help you?
Yeah,
So like,
that was Reagan.
yeah, like this, again, it highlights the main difference between the left and the right. The left wants more government control and believes, or I should say, like leads people to believe that the government needs to save us. We really need to depend on them. The right believes in less government control and more individual freedom and individual responsibility. You don't need to depend on the government. You create your own, success or whatever. So anyhow, of course, the leftist activists are just freaking out. And what do they bring up? Climate change and how this is going to hurt the EPA. Well, I'm sorry, but like, let's just use common sense, people. What has the EPA actually done for us? Like, still to this day, our water and food is poisoned. And they want to act like the EPA is saving us from these big evil corporations. And don't get me wrong, like, I am sure that that was the intention in the beginning when it was set up. But what's happened, and it happens with every agency like this, is they start out with good intentions, but then these big, bad, evil corporations, they just implant people into these agencies or they pay people off. They spend a lot of money on lobbyists. So now the corporations still do whatever they want, but the taxpayer now has to pay billions of tax dollars to government agencies that really don't do shit to protect us. And I would go as far to say they're now being used against us. I mean, you just look at like what the rogue CIA and FBI has done recently to conservatives. They're not protecting Americans. They're attacking us.
Yeah, this ruling is a huge step in the right direction for getting rid of government overreach. And quite honestly, like the EPA and other federal agencies should never have had this kind of rogue power in the first place. It goes against our Constitution. It very clearly states this power should only lie with Congress and the courts, and that's who this decision brings the power back to, our elected officials. And I was reading this article in Raw Story, and it was totally trashing the Supreme Court for this decision. But I bring it up because it pointed out that the lower courts have relied on the Chevron doctrine over 18,000 times to determine environmental regulations, which is fucking insane. And so, of course, like you were saying, we have people on the left who are arguing that Congress is too politically polarized. Lawmakers don't have time to pass regulations to protect people, and they don't have the expertise that, trained people in these agencies have. And you know what? I can't argue that point about Congress because I think our Congress is a complete clown show. Their decision-making process is disastrous because all they do is catfight in chambers. And I stand by what I've said many times before that we need to clean house, get rid of the uniparty and all these lifer reps and senators who literally do nothing but collect a paycheck for 40 years. And I can also agree with the fact that Congress doesn't have the expertise that people in some of these agencies have. So there's obviously a need for some kind of like common sense way to work with the experts to come to decisions. But those decisions should ultimately lie with the lawmakers and not with these regulatory agencies that have been given free rein to do whatever the fuck they want for years. And I have to point out this comment from Senator Mike Lee from Utah, because when this came out on Friday, he posted on X and he said, quote, "For decades, Congress has relied on a lazy technique. Rather than electing real laws, Congress has delegated much of its lawmaking power to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. This ruling will force Congress to relearn how to write real laws," end quote. And I hope he's right. But I'm also happy that this ruling is like a big blow to the Biden admin and all of their ridiculous climate agenda regulations that have been literally destroying our economy and bankrupting American businesses and families, especially when it comes to shit like the recently finalized legislation for power plant emissions reductions and tailpipe standards, which are part of, Biden's push for the electric vehicle mandate. And we have talked at length on this podcast about how completely asinine this whole EV program is and the billions of dollars of taxpayer money that the Biden admin has wasted on this epic failure infrastructure bill and climate change regulations. And I don't think we've ever talked about this, but when I was doing research, Stephanie, did you know that 24 states are in a lawsuit with the Biden admin right now over an EPA ruling back in February about soot regulations? Like, This
My
is part,
God.
yeah, this is part of their maniacal climate change agenda in wanting to limit fine particulate matter pollution. And so Biden talks a big game about how his great infrastructure plan has created all these jobs and helped our economy. But his administration is literally being sued by 24 states because this EPA regulation is not only raising costs for manufacturers, increasing electricity rates, and it's also blocking manufacturing facilities and infrastructure projects. It's like the complete opposite. So, yes, these agencies need to be reined in. And as a side note and fun fact, Stephanie, do you know how this whole Supreme Court reversal even came about? Because it involves one of your favorite agencies, the NOAA.
No, I hadn't even heard this.
Yeah, so this challenge to the Chevron doctrine actually started in 2020 when the NOAA, which that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they came up with this complete bullshit regulation requiring fishing companies to hire someone to act as like an at-sea monitor on board their ships. And it was going to cost fishermen like $700 a day to pay for this monitor person, which was often more than like their daily profit bringing in from fishing. So 3 of the fisheries sued the NOAA with the help of the New Civil Liberties Alliance. And the First Circuit Court upheld the NOAA's rule based on the Chevron deference. So what they do, they took it up the chain, it landed in the Supreme Court, and that's how this whole process began to overturn the ruling.
You know, that's a really good story. I feel like that's a story that should be told at schools to kids because I think it just highlights that, like, we always think that we can't really make a difference. We have no control over things. But if 3 fisheries could, like, go all the way to the Supreme Court and basically overturn something that will take out the deep state, like, that's incredible. Like, that is absolutely, that's such a good story. Um, yeah, I think that the Supreme Court ruling is going to change everything. I think it's going to limit their power of the federal agencies and bring things back into checks and balances, which we all need. Like, there's no denying things have gotten completely out of control. And Tara, like, I think this sets it up for Trump because now if he does get in there, he can get rid of most of these agencies or at least clean house and get rid of the majority of unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah, I hope he follows through on that because all of these 3-letter agencies literally need to be fucking gutted.
Yeah, and that's, I know a lot of people have talked about that. Vivek has talked about it. It's in that Project 2025. And I think this really lays the groundwork to do that. And man, do we need it. So amazingly, like, that's not all that's happened this week in the Supreme Court. They have been really busy. There was also a major win for January 6th defendants. So I didn't realize this, but most of the January 6th defendants were charged with multiple counts, which I knew. But the only felony count for most of them is obstruction. And according to the Hill, quote, the charge makes it a crime to corruptly obstruct, impede, or interfere with official inquiries and investigations by Congress and carries a maximum sentence of 20 years imprisonment. More than 350 January 6 defendants were charged with obstruction of an official proceeding for interrupting the congressional certification of the 2020 election, end quote. Well, the Supreme Court just narrowed this, which caused a federal judge to reopen a bunch of the January 6 cases and is likely going to free a lot of people and get rid of that felony charge. And according to Reuters, quote, the court in the decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts took a narrow view of the obstruction statute, saying that prosecutors must show that a defendant impaired the availability or integrity of documents or other records related to an official proceeding or attempted to do so. Roberts was joined by fellow conservative justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh. Again, where's Amy Coney Barrett? Anyhow, even liberal Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And
Yeah, that
so
was a surprise.
I know, right? Roberts rejected the Justice Department's more expansive reading of what constitutes obstruction, calling it a novel interpretation that would criminalize a broad swath of prosaic conduct, exposing activists and lobbyists alike to decades in prison, end quote. So I think that's why the liberal judge and the conservative judges were in agreement, because this would completely limit peaceful protests and activists. And once again, the Biden alphabet agencies push things way too far to their own detriment. So you have all of these January 6ers that have been imprisoned for years with no trial, all for this one felony obstruction charge. And now that will likely free them. So I don't know about you, Tara. I felt like this was a huge week for restoring justice in America.
Yeah, I question, I really think the Biden admin's going to do everything in their power to keep these people in prison, and they're going to come up with something and challenge the ruling. But it's fantastic. And of course, the leftist media wants us to think otherwise. I just have to read this quote, Stephanie. I saw this in a publication called Alternate, and it's a quote from this quote conservative legal expert, and his name is Norman Ornstein. He's an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprises Institute. And his belief is that the Supreme Court has grown too powerful and that it's going to permanently alter our democratic system. So here's what he wrote. Quote, I wonder how long it will take for Americans to wake up to the brutal reality that the U.S. Supreme Court has staged a coup, brazenly seizing power from the other two branches in a way that is utterly contrary to the framers' vision of the role of a court and a judiciary. And it is crystal clear that if Donald Trump wins, the Supreme Court will be much closer to the Russian or Hungarian courts than the one in our Constitution, end quote. And it's like, no, that's what's happening under Biden, except instead of the Supreme Court, it's been the three-letter agencies who have brazenly seized power. And now it's time to revert back to what our Constitution was designed for and take that fucking power back.
Yes, well said.
And I have one more Supreme Court decision to point out from this past week, and it's being overshadowed by these major rulings that are getting all the media attention. But I think this ruling is definitely going to cause some waves, especially in blue states and cities that have a significant homeless problem. So in another 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court overturned a lower court ruling related to a case in Grants Pass, Oregon, where the Ninth Circuit Court originally ruled that it was a violation of the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment to penalize people who sleep in public places like parks and alleys. And this case came back up a couple years ago in 2022 when San Francisco got so bad with their homeless population and so overrun with crime that the city changed their let the lunatics run the asylum stance, and they decided to finally start clearing out homeless encampments. And so when they did that, they were sued by the Coalition on Homelessness. Well, on Friday, the Supreme Court overturned the ruling to allow cities to prohibit homeless people from sleeping and camping in public spaces. In the majority opinion, Justice Gorsuch wrote, quote, homelessness is complex. Its causes are many. So may be the public policy responses required to address it. At bottom, the question this case presents is whether the Eighth Amendment grants federal judges primary responsibility for assessing those causes and devising those responses. It does not, end quote. He added that the Eighth Amendment serves many purposes, but it doesn't authorize federal judges to dictate the nation's homelessness policy, which I totally agree with. So, of course, you've got lawmakers in blue cities and states that are losing their shit over this. And all these organizations for the homeless saying it's going to make the situation worse. But, like, let the hypocrisy begin. Because do you want to know who of all people was in support of this ruling, Stephanie?
Who?
Fucking Gavin Newsom. Like, dictator of the state that is quite literally home to one of the largest homeless populations in the country. And the reason there are so many homeless people in California is because there's no enforcement of city ordinances or codes throughout any blue city in the state when it comes to these homeless encampments and people sleeping on the streets. And again, I've said this before, I can attest to this personally because I worked Skid Row in Los Angeles for several years, and I dealt with it on a daily basis. And so Newsom was reportedly pleased with the ruling, which shocked the fuck out of me. And here's what he said. He said that it, quote, provides state and local officials the definitive authority to implement and enforce policies to clear unsafe homeless encampments and helps us deliver common sense measures to protect the safety and well being of our communities, end quote. Stephanie, tell me that doesn't sound like a man wanting to be our next president.
That is exactly what I was going to say. I'm like, this is what he's going to say when he's questioned on why his state is an absolute mess with homeless people everywhere. He's going to say, well, we didn't have the authority, but now we do. And now, da, 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 da. And I mean, so crazy. But it's also interesting because DeSantis, the governor here in Florida, he had put forward a bill to make homelessness in Florida illegal. Like, you can't sleep on the streets, which he was getting a ton of flack for. But I think that they were waiting on this ruling to decide if that was legal or not. And it's interesting because all these people on the left looking at these cases, just like you had said earlier, they're trying to make it sound like the Supreme Court is just wild and gone rogue, when really what they've done is they're giving power back to the states and local governments. They did it with this, they did it with Roe v. Wade. Like, they're trying to they're saying we aren't all powerful and the federal government shouldn't even be involved in these decisions. It should go back to the states. So they're actually like the opposite of what the left is trying to claim that they are. So really interesting. Dan
And
Newsom.
I know. Well, we'll get more on him this week. But
Mhm.
speaking of presidents, I think it's today, Monday, is the final day of the term or something for the Supreme Court. So I think they're expected to hand down their opinion on Trump's presidential immunity claim for the Mar-a-Lago case later today. So I am like really curious to see how that one pans out, because that could also be huge in keeping with,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
that'll be good.
But I want to end this on a funny note. So, you know how Biden had, I don't know, well, he had this fundraiser in the Hamptons. Like, I think it was the day after the debate.
Yeah. And he looked like a totally different person all of a sudden, which was
Yeah.
weird.
And I heard like a bunch of high profile donors pulled out. But the funny thing is, somebody flew a plane over the fundraiser and it was carrying a banner and it said Biden and it was spelled out BI-DONE instead of Biden. And I'm like, hell yeah, I like that. So I thought that was pretty funny.
That's hilarious. Yeah, he absolutely is done. And we're actually going to get into that on the next episode. So everyone really needs to tune in on Wednesday because we have some interesting things to talk about with this whole campaign and what's going to happen with Biden. So yeah, stick around for that on Wednesday. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a great day.